obviously heard a bit about him. We kind of discussed maybe bringing him in our last call, and thankfully he said yes. He's really shaking up politics in Rhode Island right now, thinking about people first. And with what's going on in the world right now, I couldn't think of a more perfect time for you to be here. So with that being said, please take it away, David Morales.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope y'all are doing well, especially with what is relatively hotter weather than usual, to say the very least. So my name is David Morales, and for the last 5 years, I have served as a state representative for House District 7 right here in Providence, which is essentially the Mount Pleasant, Valley, and Elmhurst neighborhoods. Now, I often preface with just telling a bit about myself and my own background, because I believe that more often than not, that's what shapes one's values. And I myself grew up to a single immigrant mom who immigrated from Mexico in the late 80s. And unfortunately, considering the fact that my dad suffered from substance use issues, she was forced to raise my sister and I on her own. And so that often looked like having to work a multitude of minimum wage jobs. We went through the public school system, we grew up in public housing, and it was really when I got older that I made a lot of the connections. The connections that relate to what investments is government making to support some of our most vulnerable in order to make sure that they have access to opportunities and economic mobility. And so I stand here now at 26 years of age, having been elected at 21 and having now served what is going to be my third term here at the State House. I like to think that it demonstrates that, again, there is a return on investment when government is looking out for some of our most vulnerable. And so a few days ago, at the peak hours of 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, we adjourned for the 2025 legislative session. Now, needless to say, the last 6 months have been a whirlwind of emotions. Most recently, I've been sensing a lot of fear. I've been feeling a lot of fear and terror just in regards to what's been going on. The attacks that our immigrant neighbors have had to experience. You combine that with some of the ongoing discussions as to what's happening internationally with Iran and everything in between. There's just so much chaos coming out of DC. And we expected that after November, right? We all knew that there was going to be some sense of abnormalcy following the last presidential election. But what it showed me more than anything is it further reiterated why local government is so important, why advocacy is so important. And I have to tell you, a lot of the advocates did not disappoint, because when we started session this past January, we had advocates and activists from all across the state showing up to the State House, going to the committee hearings, hosting press conferences and rallies to draw attention to some of the most critical issues to what is happening here in our backyard. And I'd like to say that this legislative session, like any, there are moments of frustration where we did not necessarily achieve everything that we sought for, but at the same time, we met the moment. I think this year at the State House, we met the moment as it relates to healthcare, to education, and planting the investments necessary to build more housing in a way that we can ensure that people who want to live in our state and work in our state can actually afford to live here. And I also want to preface with the fact that this was the year that some advocates who had been out on the front lines for over 20 years talking about the same issues finally got some of their key pieces of legislation passed. Some of that relates to public safety in relation to firearms. For many years now, we had a lot of folks from the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action actively showing up, trying to ensure that we joined Connecticut and Massachusetts when it came to prohibiting access to assault weapons, to literal weapons of war. And even though it was a contentious debate between the House and the Senate, we got it done. We were finally able to pass that piece of legislation that now aligns us with what is done in our neighboring states. And I say that because, again, it did not happen overnight. It required advocates, especially those that felt a really strong sense of the need to take advocacy, especially after Sandy Hook. There were a lot of families that showed up. There were a lot of advocates that showed up to make it possible. And so you'll see on the handout that I presented is I really wanted, more than anything else, for this to be a discussion. I wanted to give you the full rundown as to what happened this year at the State House, what didn't happen. Because as much as I'm happy about some of the achievements we made, I'm already starting to think about what does it look like when we return in January of 2026. what else are we going to be organizing and advocating for to make improvements in our state? But to start on the positive notes, you'll notice that one of these sections with the most bullet points is healthcare. Because again, I made a reference earlier. I believe that this year at the State House, we met the moment. Right now, we're in a situation where most Rhode Islanders do not have access to a primary care provider. And it's not a secret as to why that is. If you are a primary care doctor doing the exact same work in this state, you could be paid a lot more doing that in Massachusetts or Connecticut. Because the way it works in our state is the fact that over 300,000 Rhode Islanders have Medicaid. They have government assistance healthcare. Unfortunately, for decades on end, we had not made the investments necessary to increase those rates for our primary care providers. So while Massachusetts and Connecticut each and every single year were increasing their rates for primary care doctors, we just weren't. And it's important to note that the investments that we made in Medicaid or don't make also influence commercial insurance. Commercial insurers like United or Blue Cross Blue Shield will look at the Medicaid rates and say, well, if they're not increasing, why should we on the commercial side also increase? So this is why it goes back to this famous saying, right? Rising tides lifts all boats. And so I'm pleased that for the first time in about 15 years, we finally made the investments necessary to increase primary care provider rates. And that's going to mean a boost for a lot of people who are now going to be able to go to a doctor who will accept Medicaid. We're now pushing Blue Cross Blue Shield and United Health to increase their commercial rates so they're higher than the state standard. And at the same time, this is the structure that will prevent more primary care providers from making the decision to pick up and move their practice over the border. You'll also note on there, in between healthcare, there was a lot of discussion around medical debt. Again, meeting the moment. We're at a point right now where medical debt has become one of the leading factors as to why people feel the need to file for bankruptcy. Why folks have to refinance their home. A lot of this ties back to medical expenses that they simply cannot afford. And so we took some action this year by being very clear as to what consumer protections actually exist when it relates to medical debt. And that starts by saying that there's going to be a cap on how much interest that can even accumulate to begin with. In addition to that, there were some policies recorded as well for the medical debt piece to ensure that moving forward, it cannot use to put a lien on one's home. Because we have had cases where hospitals have literally put a lien on a person's home because they owed medical debt, in addition to ensuring that there's no garnishing of wages. So again, these are all about some of the most basic protections. And again, I feel that when I even hear the term medical debt, I still can't believe that that's a real concept. But the reality is it exists. But in terms of what we can do locally, that's been one of our responses. And I know, again, I made a reference earlier about the fact that we had certain pieces of legislation, we had some initiatives that were only accomplished because advocates showed up year in and year out. So for some of us who might live here on this part of the city, you might know going down North Main Street, there is a Sesame Street looking sign called Empire Loans. It's a payday lending operation. And what payday lending has done to our communities, especially Black and brown communities, over the last 3+ decades, it has forced people to find themselves into cycles of debt. Because they go to a payday lender, they don't necessarily have to open up an account, and they're able to borrow thousands of dollars at a time. But what happens is, unlike banks that are highly regulated, where you can put a cap on the interest that's collected, you go to a payday lender, they can add up the interest to be over 100%. So if you went to a payday lender just to borrow $500, if you're late with a payment by just 1 week, that $500 request and borrowing has now turned into $2,000. And now you're forced to go on a payment plan that's still collecting debt. Hence why I say it's cycles of debt that are being created. So what we did this year to position ourselves uniquely is we teamed up with a lot of our local credit unions, a lot of our local banks, and we said, hey, we want you to come out to the State House and demonstrate to lawmakers that there are low interest programs that your banks offer to those that might not have credit. That way you can demonstrate to lawmakers that there are alternatives instead of just going to these predatory payday lenders. Because that's one piece I really want to emphasize, is that we as lawmakers have our own lived experience. We also have our professional experience in terms of what we do during the day, considering that we are a part-time legislature. But I say that because we are a citizen legislature. We're not necessarily staffed with policy analysts that report to us. We have 75 representatives, and we have about 4 policy staff, right? So that's 4 policy staff among 75 legislators. So we are not always the most informed around some of these issues. And so what happens is we have a frustrating structure where the ones who actually come to us and inform us about the bills are either advocates or lobbyists that are paid by their clients. And this is why I made a reference earlier. It's so important when advocates show up. Because advocates are the ones that are able to come to us and say, hey, don't always believe what the lobbyist representing Empire Loans is telling you. Because Empire Loans is going to tell you they're the only ones in town that can take care of people who don't have credit. We as advocates have teamed up with the banks, and now we're here to offer alternatives. But similarly, it also makes a difference when we have people from all across the state coming out to the State House to come to our committee hearings, because we get to hear a lot of the stories as well. We've been talking about this issue around payday lending for 15 years. This was the 15th year where we had a House committee hearing where we had a working parent that went up to the stand and testified in front of legislators and had to be very vulnerable to say, I was a victim of someone who borrowed $700 and then found themselves stuck in a cycle of debt where I had to pay $5,000 over the course of 3 years. And keep in mind, everything we do is available on public access television. A lot of what we do and what we say gets recorded in the Providence Journal or the Boston Globe. So it does mean a lot when people come and share their stories, because they know that they're susceptible to having their stories shared with the whole world. But it's those stories that need to be told, because that's what makes the difference when legislators are starting to think about how they're going to vote on an issue. And so while it wasn't the case years ago, this year, when we finally put payday lending and we voted it out of committee and brought it to the House floor and the Senate floor, it passed almost unanimously. And it passed almost unanimously because a lot of the legislators had an opportunity to hear these stories. And they knew that when they were voting yes to prohibit the practice of payday lending moving forward, that they were going to be able to protect working parents that would find themselves in vulnerable positions. Another issue that I think often comes to mind as well is housing. We all know that we have a severe housing shortage in our state, becoming less and less affordable each and every single year. We have neighbors who are having to find themselves be displaced, or they're trying to downsize, but they can't downsize because if they sell their home, it's still going to be hard to afford another home. So what we've taken an approach this year at the legislature is a combination of 2 things. One, building up the foundation to have the funding available to actually build affordable housing. Because I'll tell you right now, when it comes to private development, they're always going to be centered around trying to build market or luxury rate housing, because that's how they can maximize profits. So it's really up to the government to build a team up with nonprofits to say, we're going to build housing that is actually affordable to people who make less than $80,000 a year, because that's the vast majority of Rhode Islanders. In our state, the median income is around $65,000. But the question is, are we building housing for those median income earners? And right now we're not. So what we did this year in the legislature is we took a look at some of the most local oriented laws, and that is zoning laws. What is allowed to be built, what isn't allowed to be built. If you go into certain communities, and I'm going to make a reference quickly to the East Bay, there are certain situations where you need to own at least 2 acres of land just to build a single family home. Think about that, 2 acres of land just for one single family home. We're not even talking about dense multi-family home development. Now there's often reasons for it. Sometimes it's because there's a lack of water and sewer that one can connect to. But at the same time, there's also other elements, such as NIMBYism. Not in my backyard, we don't want any housing being built in our neighborhood. So what we did is we passed some laws that encourage and require municipalities to expand zoning opportunities for development to be built. For example, we have a lot of development that might be happening in Newport that would be considered mixed use. So being able to build residential housing on top of commercial businesses. Because again, I think that often meets the moment. You could build an apartment upstairs from a small business that can house a family. And similarly, we were able to put forward what you'll see on your sheet is referenced as the Taylor Swift tax. So I want to be clear, it does not directly tax Taylor Swift as an individual, but it does apply to her because of the reasons I'm going to share. So the Taylor Swift tax, the way it's written, essentially says that if you have a non-owner occupied home, that means you don't rent it out, that means you yourself don't live there, you just have it vacant. It's probably maybe a beach home where you only spend like 30 days out of the year. But if you own a second property that is not rented out or is not used by you for at least half the year, and it's worth over $1 million, it is now susceptible to this new tax. And the reason for that is because some of that revenue that's going to be generated is going to be for the purposes of being able to build out affordable housing. Now, we have a case where we actually are home to a lot of celebrities. And we have certain celebrities that don't have their main residencies here in our state, but love to come out to Newport, love to go out to certain parts of Smithfield during the summer when it's nice. But again, they're only occupying that home for about 3 to 4 weeks out of the year. And we have a lot of this information available through our local tax assessor's offices. And so when we looked at the data and we had an understanding that there was this ongoing issue of housing that was just being unoccupied and is worth a lot of money, we recognize that that's an example where we can have certain people that call Rhode Island home, even if it's only for a few weeks, they can pay their fair share and support us when we build up the revenue to be able to build out more housing in the future. And then one issue that I'll just touch on that's really personal to me that I was very happy about, that I'm always looking out for, is discussions around the minimum wage. So I know I prefaced it earlier. I grew up with a single immigrant mom who worked a multitude of minimum wage jobs to support my older sister and I. And so I often think back to this concept of the minimum wage because it's the lowest amount that a business is allowed to pay a person for 1 hour's worth of labor. Like when you really break it down, that's what it means. And so that's always become a question of what's the dollar value that we put towards some of our most vulnerable workers? And I think it's always important to write out the notion that minimum wage workers aren't necessarily just quote unquote teenagers working a summer job, because that's the rhetoric I often get met. I always think it's important to make the reality clear that there are over 80,000 people in our state that earn minimum wage, most of whom are working parents. In that said, we took the steps a few years ago to raise the minimum wage to $15 by 2025. So today, the minimum wage is $15 because of the work we did a few years back. But I was always a little nervous as to what would happen after 2025. What would happen January 1st of 2026? Would we still be at 15? Or would we be taking the steps to continuously increase the wage? And I'm happy to report that this year we passed a 2-year phase-in minimum wage increase. So that means that starting January 1st of 2026, the minimum wage will go up to $16, and then going into 2027, it will increase to $17. And there we go on the clap. Yeah. Like I said, not one that received a lot of buzz necessarily, which I was quite surprised by, because I remember when we passed the $15 minimum wage, it was a really big deal. And this year we passed this one, and I was like, no one's going to talk about it? Like, no one's going to report on it? And don't get me wrong, like most of the laws that we pass that you'll see on there will not take effect until January 1st of next year. So that's also something really important to consider, is nothing's going to pass with the snap of a finger. And then the last bill I'll just highlight before I really just want to open it up for discussion and questions. This one, again, was also very personal to me. I spent a lot of time at our local library. My lovely girlfriend, Andrea's in the back, and she has a sister with developmental disabilities, and her sister also spent a lot of time at the library. But I myself grew up in the library. I made a reference to my mom. So similarly, during the summers, she would always drop me off at the library and pick me up before she had to work at the second shift. But I always knew that the library was a safe space where I could go. Unfortunately, because of the national rhetoric and the politics that's happened in DC, our libraries have become politicized. We've had conversations, and we've seen in our own backyard. Since 2021, there have been over 28 attempts to try to censor and ban books in our state. And it's happened across the state. Between Foster, Gloucester, but also a case in Providence, where you had patrons harassing librarians, calling them disgusting names and telling them to pull a book off the shelf. And for a long time, over the course of the last 4 years, as this was happening, librarians didn't know what to do because we didn't have any policies in place as to what was censorship, what was not censorship. Did they have the right to apply pressure on someone to remove a book off the shelves? And there's some sad cases where we did see some books quietly tucked away in foster and Gloucester because the librarians just didn't want to deal with the harassment. And that said, I received a lot of outreach from some of these librarians who, again, were willing to share with me their story and some of the anxiety that they felt for months having to go to work because of the fact that they just couldn't simply do their job of curating materials without being called names. So last year we started working on an initiative called the Freedom to Read Act. It is an act that has now been adopted by 8 other states. And what it essentially does is it creates model policies all across the state for how library collections are curated, but most importantly, ensuring that there is no layers of censorship that happen in our libraries. If a person is concerned about library material within a book, similar to anything else in government, they will go through a process. They will fill out a form, they will describe what their actual issue with the book is, they will verify that they have actually read through the entire book as opposed to just nitpicking certain passages. And it creates an actual structure and an environment for there to be uniformity. But most importantly, for there to be a process. That way it doesn't create the hostile environment our librarians have had to live through over the last couple of years. And so we established this new process, we established protections for our librarians. And this is something very meaningful because unlike some of the laws I talked about right now, this is one that's going to get adopted almost immediately. So we passed it 2 weeks ago, passed it through the Senate last week. It's about to get signed into law over the next couple of weeks. And once it does, I've already talked to the Chief of Library Services who's helping adopt some of these policies, who told me we're ready to get them implemented in our public schools, we're ready to get it implemented into our public libraries. But what this means is it has a very strong message. That we believe in free expression, we believe in free speech, but most importantly, we believe that every story deserves to be told. Because I didn't have to tell you what types of books were the ones being challenged earlier, because I imagine you could have already been able to imagine which kinds they were. They were the ones having to do with communities of color, books that touched on the topics of race and LGBTQ plus community members. But now that we've taken these steps, we're going to ensure that all of our librarians are protected and we don't have acts of censorship. And so I make another reference. That was grassroots community organizing. And the Freedom to Read Coalition was one that was built through librarians, through community members, through students, through labor unions. There was a very large umbrella of advocates that worked on this issue. And similar to a lot of the bills that you'll see based on the bullet points and different headers, a lot of them only happened because community members showed up. And I think that's something that's really important to be able to share now. Because even though we've closed out the legislative session for this year, I often like to remind a lot of our community members that the city council, school board, they're still meeting. They're not going to go on a 6-month recess like we do in the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're still going to be meeting, discussing issues in terms of what's happening locally. And it's important for us to be a part of that process. Otherwise, decisions are made in silence. And one term that I've just been thinking about a lot recently over the last couple of weeks is democracy dies in silence. And that often happens when, again, we allow for decisions to be made without community engagement, or we see tactics coming in from the federal government where they're terrorizing our communities, and we decide to stay silent. And I think Rhode Island has been a model and an example for the nation of what it looks like to stand up. The number of protests that we've had over the last couple of weeks, the number of demonstrations, has been really meaningful. Because when we mobilize, people show up. You can't say the same thing in other states. Other states try to hold demonstrations or protests to demonstrate solidarity, and a lot of people don't show up. But I feel like every time it happens in Rhode Island, whether it's in front of the State House or India Point Park, you can expect hundreds of people to march together.
Thousands.
And thousands especially. I'll never forget 2 Saturdays ago, the No Kings Day. Between the State House where you had thousands, India Point Park where you had thousands, and again, there was so much to discuss and come together as a community. People were coming together as a community to talk about the importance of not dismantling our public education system. People were coming together about the importance of standing together in solidarity with our immigrant neighbors. And that was really meaningful. In the same way, like we're able to gather here today and like share this space, share some bread and some food together, like it's meaningful to have these conversations. So I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to like share this space, be able to talk a little bit about what we did here at the State House. And I would love to like take any questions or just have more conversation or dialogue in terms of what more we can do at the legislature, because I think there's a lot more work for us, especially knowing that the next 3 years is going to be a little tough. So thank you again.
First of all, the League of Women Voters actually did support the Freedom to Read Act.
Yes, you did.
Coalition. And as someone who had a 40-plus year career in public libraries, starting right here in Providence, Rhode Island, and ending in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I want to tell you that was one that was near and dear to my heart. So I am very grateful for your leadership on that. And I look forward to us strengthening the bill.
Yes.
Going forward, because I know there were some things that fell out that were important. So yay for that. Also, I know that you were pushing for ethnic studies. And as we look at, I think anybody who lives in Rhode Island has to know how important the diversity of our community is to our strength as a state. And so, anything we can do to support our immigrants, anything we can to support young people who are trying to understand who they are and how they fit is important. So you're not going to drop that, are you?
Absolutely not. No, so this was my first year introducing ethnic studies, which is essentially legislation that says that every public school in the state of Rhode Island, as a part of a high school graduation requirement, would have to offer ethnic studies, right? Which really dives a little deeper into our country's, again, discussion around race relations, but most importantly, the ethnic backgrounds of different community members. Now, what's really special to note is that bill actually came to me because students were the ones that proposed it. So there's this coalition of young people across Providence called Our Schools PD. And they're made up of the Providence Student Union, Southeast Asians for Education, Providence Youth Student Movement. So these are all youth-oriented groups. And for the last couple of years, they've been on the front lines at Providence School Board meetings, advising that the Providence School Board adopt ethnic studies. Now, some of y'all may know, we've been under a state takeover the last couple of years right here in Providence. So the school board has often told them, hey, we'd like to adopt it, we just don't have the power to do so. So this year, the students approached me and said, how about we continue our advocacy but take it to the State House? Because the more we think about it, ethnic studies, yes, it's important to Providence because of how diverse we are, but really, it's important to the whole state because we are such a diverse state between our 39 cities and towns. So we had a really great hearing that, I will kid you not, lasted like about 4 hours, which I felt really bad about for the youth because a lot of the kiddos had school the next day. And so I kept telling the chairman, hey, we get the students going on first, like that might make it better for everyone. But I'll certainly be reintroducing the bill next year without question.
And I have a question. I think it's wonderful that you increase reimbursement for Medicaid providers, but the big beautiful bill that's wending its way through Congress promises major Medicaid cuts. So what is Rhode Island going to do when these big beautiful cuts happen?
Exactly. So remember when I opened up and I said we didn't get everything we wanted this year, and there were certain issues that we were fighting for. So one of which was how do we build sustainable revenue in this state? Reality is, a lot of our revenue does direct from federal sources. The same federal sources that are on the verge of being cut by the big beautiful bill, quote unquote. One of the big ones in the chopping block is Medicaid. And when you consider the fact that for every dollar the state invests in Medicaid, we usually get a really strong federal reimbursement to go along with it, that's gonna go away. So one thing that we've been advocating for at the State House for several years was what's called a tax on the top 1% in our state. So if you make over $650,000 annually as an individual tax filer, you are considered to be a part of the economic 1% in the state of Rhode Island. So what we have often said is that there should be a tax applied to every dollar after $650,000 earned. Oftentimes this would apply to 5,000 tax filers in the state, a lot of whom, again, are wealthy through the means of either being a celebrity, owning certain businesses, but they have the assets, and we believe they can pay their fair share. That was one of the main issues that we were driving this year, is we need to build revenue through this tax because we know that we're going to lose a lot of federal money down the pipeline. And so the investments we're making today are not going to be sustainable. Unfortunately, there was a lot of pushback that came through the Chamber of Commerce, through certain business interests and groups. And they successfully, for the 6th year in a row, stopped this initiative from moving forward. But what happened was towards the end of session, it was told by the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, legislators should be ready to come back in September. Because in September, if the big beautiful bill passes, we will need to return for a special session, and one of the issues we're going to need to address is revenue. Now, it's important to note that the big beautiful bill, most of its fiscal impact starts in 2027. So we have about another year and a half that we can breathe a little bit. But fiscal year 2027 is going to be the one where the chopping block hits. Because we know that they're going to pass something out of Congress. Right now, the question is, how severe is it going to be? Regardless, it's going to hurt. So it is my hope that we do return in September. We pass our form of building up revenue for Rhode Island through the top 1% tax, and thereafter start analyzing where's the money going to be best suited. In a lot of the discussions I've had with my colleagues, I've been reassured to hear that a lot of us, when we talk about how do we use the money that we generate, a lot of them are saying it's going to have to go to Medicaid, because we're going to have to be the ones that plug in that. And similar with primary care, we need to keep that reimbursement up. Yeah.
I don't know where to start, but I congratulate you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
And what you believe. I live 6 months in Florida, and I vote there because that's where my vote counts most.
Yeah.
But it is so refreshing to hear this conversation. One thing I'm very concerned about is getting young people like you and your friend in the back and everyone you know and all your friends to come out, because when I was at the State House for that marvelous protest that we had, most people there are not young. And we need more young people. You know what? I can't go on because I get so upset about what's happening in this country. So I'm just going to be quiet and congratulate you and thank you for speaking.
Thank you for those words, because that's how I often feel. Is I'm a young person, and the issues my friends are dealing with, I always have to break down to them. The issues you're dealing with are political.
Is there a mandated course in civics in the public schools in Rhode Island?
As of 2 years ago, yes. But again, some would say a few years too late. I'm happy it's now being offered, but we have a whole generation of students that just missed out on it completely.
Mm-hmm. And what age group? Where is it? In high school?
High school, yeah.
It should start younger.
I certainly agree. Civics is a part of our everyday life, and I think right now it's especially showing that just how critical decisions from the government are.
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and in 4th grade we started civics, and we had to learn about every city, especially upstate New York, and what was their strength, where did they get their money and support. And that was 4th grade, and we went up all the way through high school. And I can still remember the teacher I had in high school who wrote that thick book for the New York regions in history. And it was invaluable. And you need to start with young kids.
Certainly. That's how you build informed citizens. And like one thing I try to do, because I've had this conversation with a lot of my friends, is like, what can we do to make this more engaging, more appealing? Because we need you to come out to the State House. We need you to be a part of these demonstrations and marches. And some of them have been like very awesome. They're like, it seems boring. And I'm like, all right, well, these decisions are really important. So one thing I've tried to do is make it fun. So I often use Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Those are the platforms that young people are on. And what I've done over the last couple of months is I make very short, sometimes humorous videos talking about what's going on at the State House today. What are the issues we're dealing with? How is a vote going to impact your life if this law passes? And sure enough, people have picked up on it. And one issue that, to me, it tugged at my heartstrings, and it was really special, is I made a video talking a little bit about what was happening with our unhoused community. There's no question about it. Our homelessness issue is continuing to grow. We have more and more unhoused neighbors everywhere you go across the state, especially in Providence. And so I made a video talking about one of my experiences where I was helping out, volunteering at a pop-up shelter. We built up a pop-up shelter back in the winter through a community center because the city didn't have enough beds. And so I talked about like the fact that this was a really big issue, a systemic issue that no one should be experiencing, and some of us have had to step up and take matters into our own hands. But I went on and I said, by the way, if you're watching this video and you believe that our neighbors deserve more dignity, we have a bill coming up that's going to mandate that the state takes more of a comprehensive approach around building pallet shelters to be able to provide housing to unhoused people. And I'll never forget, I sit on the committee where that bill was heard. Usually we just have lobbyists come out, or we have someone with embedded interest. We had a good amount of young people that came out. And a lot of them came out afterwards and told me, I came to the hearing today, I spoke for the first time, I spoke what was on my mind, and it was because I watched your video. Your video made me realize how serious this issue is, but most importantly, there's actually solutions, because all I do is complain. But to see that there was a solution available, I want to take advantage of it. So my goal is to do more of that, is to be able to just make an issue very relatable to someone, and then tell them, by the way, if you feel fired up like me, here's a way you can get involved. But it's going to take time.
There was one issue that just hit me, not only because of the content of it, but because of the hypocrisy. And that was the cutting off the project that where locally grown and produced food was going into the school lunches. And it was some relatively minor amount, like $1.3 million. And it just got me. 1.3 compared to the trillions and the national debt that he thinks, well, anyway.
Yeah.
But also that Kennedy would say that, you know, fresh food is what was going to save our children from measles and whatever. And then cut the program that sends fresh food.
Exactly.
Do you know anything about whether that has been asked permanently? I mean, is that happening?
Yeah, so I know for a fact that going into the next academic year, a lot of the school districts are trying to use any funds that they didn't use this year to extend into next year. So I've gotten some reassurance. I only speak for Providence Public Schools, given the obvious area I represent. But my conversations with them, it has been the fact that they'll have enough of the fresh food funding from the last school year to extend it out for the next school year. But after that, they're not going to be sure unless they enter local partnerships. But also an opportunity where the state steps in. And I certainly think we can.
Can you tell me who in the school department, like what the name of the office is?
I often go through the office of the superintendent.
This goes to,
Yeah, but that's the office I usually go to just to get more information about it. So, especially in Providence, our vendor is Sodexa. So right now, Sodexa is going to start having a conversation with some of the local and urban farmers to get more information as to how they can enter a partnership. And usually what the government can do in a case like that is we can grant the farms with some respective tax subsidies of some sort, just to incentivize that contract to move forward. Because I get it, right? They need to be taken care of in terms of the farms, but to your point, our kids need the fresh food as well.
I just wanted to add we focus on what we need more, but we should also celebrate the fact that Providence is filled with colleges, right? So it's filled with young people. And just recently, with Trump getting elected into office, I think everybody is kind of on 10 now. If they disagree, let's say, if they disagree with what's going on in the world right now, they are pretty locked in and they're making themselves more knowledgeable. So that kind of seems like the first step in my, I grew up in a heavy Democratic household. Like, it was a very big deal for me when I grew up, hence why I'm in this group now and kind of passing it on from my mother. But I've got twin brothers who are 22 and they couldn't tell you a single thing about what's going on in the world. Or if they could, they'd probably say, well, it doesn't affect me, I don't care, what does it matter? I don't even think about the future, like if I have children, how this could directly affect them or anything like that. I am from Massachusetts, so I see the differences from Massachusetts to here. But I will say, like, I would like to celebrate the way that you kind of bring in social media. I mean, that's kind of how I came across you as well. I mean, I am in District 7 as well, but that's how I came across, and that's how you know. And you really have to do this crazy thing, short and sweet and eye-catching to grab people's attention. And it's really amazing to see like the younger demographic really be interested in stuff like this. So one step is getting the knowledge, and then I think the next step is getting out in public. And we're getting there, and I think it has a lot to do with yourself. So,
And again, I think a lot of the work that you all do to the women voters goes such a long way. I'll never forget 2 years ago, I was at a neighbor's U.S. citizen swearing ceremony, and this was up in Johnston. He had been working for years to try to become a citizen, right? Like having to go through the exams, having to pay the fees, having to have the countless appointments with his lawyer. And upon going through that stressful process, becoming a U.S. citizen, I'll never forget once he stepped out that door and took a right, there was a table from the League of Women Voters ready to get him registered to vote. And I remember immediately he looked at me and he's all like, "This is where I need to go." And I was like, absolutely. I was like, go right ahead. And sure enough, I helped him out, volunteer helped him out with the form, and immediately on day one, he became a registered voter. And again, I think that's something really important for us to recognize. Like, those small acts go such a long way. Right? Like the act of having like one of our immigrant neighbors, and again, especially right now, given the turbulent times, like we have immigrant neighbors who are becoming citizens as young as like 20, and then we have those who've been in this country for decades, are over the age of 60 and are now finally becoming citizens. So that goes a really long way in terms of building up community. And so I think oftentimes when we start talking about how do we get people connected, it starts with community. And so I hope that effort continues to go forward, and then that step further is how can we start inviting some of the folks that we help register to be a part of our meetings as well.
So on the way over here, I heard an NPR program talking about the deplorable condition of our bridges. Really scared me.
Yep. You weren't driving over a bridge, were you?
No.
Okay.
But I do wonder if there needs to be some actions at the state level. It seems as though everybody knows about the problem, but obviously money is a problem too. So are you at all focused on helping us get that done?
So I know there's this bridge called the Washington Bridge, you might have heard of it. So that was used up a lot of oxygen in terms of discussions around infrastructure at the state level. And I will say I'm pleased that we're at a point where the state has figured out how it's going to be financed. We know what the commitment is from the federal government. That cannot be clawed back. We got the money ready to go. It's out the door. The contractor's getting it. We know what our state contribution has to be as well. As a state, we're going to be investing about $200 million over the next few years for that specific bridge project. It's expected to be done with the full completion of demolition and the rebuild by 2027. Which is behind schedule. But it wouldn't be around if it wasn't behind schedule, right? I'd be a little suspicious if it was on schedule. So I think we can live with that. But the fact is we have other bridges that we need to account for, that we cannot wait to have a situation like the Washington Bridge and then scurry and be reactive. So in the conversations I have started having with the General Treasurer, so the General Treasurer's office oversees the Infrastructure Bank. The Infrastructure Bank is the entity within state government that manages where the money goes for infrastructure projects. And so I started having a conversation with them to ask, what are we going to do moving forward about our roads and our bridges? Because we know that there's a lot more issues that we're going to unfortunately see as years go on. Next year is going to be an election year. Next year is our midterm elections. What happens during any election year? You get bonds on the table. So it is my understanding there's going to be an infrastructure bond going out next year that's specifically for bridges. And the idea is to be more proactive on that front. But again, it's one of those issues, right, where it's like, better late than never, but we could have certainly used it 20 years ago.
Anybody else got anything?
I just have one quick question that I always like to ask elected officials. How do you prefer to hear from your constituents? I think it's very important that people let their elected officials know it's important to them? And how do you prefer to hear from people, and how do you use that information?
Yeah, I'll be honest, a phone call. People are always surprised when I answer my phone because I'll give someone my business card and they'll call it and they'll immediately say, I'm looking for Representative Morales. And they're like, oh, hi, how are you? And they're like, oh, I thought your like secretary was gonna answer it. And I'm like, no, like if you need to reach me, just give me a call. And I say that because there are sometimes concerns that one has where you get like so riled up about what you're trying to communicate. It can be a lot to type it all out in email. And sometimes I think if we're able to just communicate on the phone, if that even looks like us just getting on the phone and scheduling the time to then meet after to talk a little more, I think verbal communication, I mean, it's the authentic way of communication, right? That's how we grow up talking to one another. So I usually prefer phone calls, but if not, I then tell someone, feel free to just email me or text me if that's more comforting for them.
Good.
So truthfully, I would prefer people to call me instead of emailing me just
Yeah.
with the invitation.
Next time, I was being so formal.
Okay, no. But again, email works, and it's information that is useful, by the way. So I do want to know.
Sometimes putting it in writing is helpful to then you can say,
Yeah, exactly.
I got these letters from my constituents.
That is very true because we did have a lot of bills this year where we got a lot of advocacy and a lot of letters that were sent. There have certainly been moments in the past where I've had neighbors reaching out to me that have influenced the way I vote or approach an issue. And similarly, one thing I often do is host a monthly meeting. So every last Monday of the month at Mount Pleasant Library, I host my monthly community meeting where I give out handouts similar to this. We kind of talk through the issues of the month. And that is always a really good way to start getting the gauge of how people are feeling about certain issues. Because that's also an opportunity for me during January through June to start saying, all right, this bill is on the docket, might be semi-controversial. I want to hear your thoughts in terms of how you feel.
Is it the last Monday of the month?
Yeah, so we'll be having one next Monday. Yeah, June 30th.
Mm-hmm.
And we always have food. That's one thing I've always. Yeah, you'd be surprised. I'll tell you this. I remember when I first started having my meetings, I would have about like 20 people show up. But then one day I was just like, yo, what if I just brought some food? What if I get some empanadas, get some soda? Like, it's going to cost me like, what, $60 in between everything? Ever since then, we always get at least 40 people. We've literally doubled attendance because people know that they're going to be fed, as they should be, right? Like if you're taking the time to be at a meeting, same way we're going to be fed right now, which again, I can't say thank you enough for. Like, again, we deserve to be able to like share some food with one another, especially on an evening.
What time is that?
At 6:30.
Are we pretty well finished with the questions, or?
Yeah.
How are we doing?
Yep, we're good.
Okay.
This was wonderful. Thank you again so much.
There is space on the porch, and it has a ceiling fan. So, to